The sound of clinking champagne glasses filled the air, accompanied by the soft hum of a jazz band in the corner of the grand ballroom. Beneath the dazzling chandeliers of New York's most exclusive hotel, laughter echoed among the elite. Blake Cooper, the man everyone in the room either admired or envied, stood near the bar with his signature confident smirk. His tailored black tuxedo fit like a second skin, and the glint in his dark eyes reflected his unmatched self-assurance. "Blake," Ethan Moore called out, a glass of whiskey in his hand and a mischievous grin on his face. "Tell me, is there anything you wouldn't do for a bet?" Blake raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Ethan, you should know by now. There's nothing I can't handle." Ethan leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to pique Blake's interest. "Then I have a challenge for you, one even you might find impossible." Blake's curiosity sparked. "Go on, find someone completely opposite of your usual type," Ethan began, swirling his glass. "Marry her. Stay married for 6 months. No exceptions, no loopholes." Blake laughed, a deep, rich sound that drew attention from nearby guests. "Marry someone not my type? You're setting the bar too low." Ethan smirked, his gaze darting across the room. "Not just anyone. Her." He gestured discreetly toward a woman standing near the edge of the dance floor. Blake followed his friend's gaze and froze momentarily. She wasn't the polished, predictable socialite he was accustomed to charming. No, this woman was different. Her blonde curls framed a determined face with sharp green eyes that scanned the room with quiet confidence. She wore a simple, elegant black dress that contrasted starkly with the extravagant gowns around her. Her posture was relaxed, almost indifferent, as though the opulence around her barely registered. "That's Emily Rivers," Ethan explained, clearly enjoying Blake's uncharacteristic hesitation. "An artist, fiercely independent, and rumor has it, she has zero patience for men like you." Blake's smirk returned, sharper this time. "You think I can't handle her?" "I think she'll chew you up and spit you out," Ethan replied, raising his glass in a mock toast. Blake chuckled. Challenge accepted. The night unfolded quickly. Blake maneuvered his way toward Emily with the calculated charm of a man who is rarely told no. She noticed him immediately. His presence was hard to miss, but she didn't flinch or blush like others often did. Instead, she looked him directly in the eye, her expression unreadable. "Blake Cooper," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "Emily Rivers," she replied, shaking it firmly. Her grip was steady, her tone even. "Let me guess you're here to buy one of my pieces." Blake raised an eyebrow, genuinely intrigued. "Should I be?" "That depends," she said with a faint smile. "Do you know anything about art?" Blake laughed. "Not much, but I know how to appreciate beauty." Emily rolled her eyes, but there was a flicker of amusement behind them. "If you're trying to impress me, you'll have to do better than tired cliches." "I wasn't trying to impress you," Blake countered smoothly. "Just stating a fact." Emily tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "Why are you really here, Mr. Cooper?" Blake hesitated, the weight of the bet lingering in his mind, but he wasn't ready to reveal his hand. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice lowering just enough to create an air of intimacy. "What if I told you I'm here because you're the most fascinating person in this room?" Emily laughed, a sound that was equal parts genuine and skeptical. "I'd say you're either a liar or a fool." "Maybe I'm a bit of both," Blake admitted, grinning. "But I'm also serious." As the evening progressed, Blake found himself drawn to Emily in a way he hadn't anticipated. She was sharp, unyielding, and completely unimpressed by his wealth and status. For the first time in years, Blake felt out of his depth, but it only fueled his determination. When the gala began winding down, Blake made his move. "Emily," he said, his tone suddenly earnest. "I know this might sound crazy, but I'd like to see you again." Emily arched an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because you're not like anyone I've ever met," he replied honestly. Emily hesitated, her gaze searching his face for signs of insincerity. Finally, she nodded. "Fine, but don't expect me to fall for your usual tricks." Blake smiled, sensing that the real challenge had only just begun. Ending note. As Emily left the gala, a small, knowing smile played on her lips. She had her reasons for agreeing to see Blake again, reasons she wasn't ready to share. Whatever game he thought he was playing, she had her own rules. And this time, she intended to win. Blake Cooper stood in the sprawling living room of his Manhattan penthouse, his arms crossed as he observed Emily Rivers. The contrast between them was glaring. The sleek, modern decor reflected his meticulously curated life, pristine white walls, minimalist furniture, and an unobstructed view of the New York City skyline. Yet here stood Emily, unbothered by the grandeur, her attention instead captured by a small abstract sculpture on the mantel. "Your taste is expected," she remarked, her tone as dry as the martini he'd offered her upon arrival. Blake arched an eyebrow, his confidence unshaken. "And what does that mean?" Emily turned, her green eyes sharp. "It's all surface level. Beautiful but hollow." Her words hit harder than he expected, though he masked his reaction with a grin. "I suppose I could say the same about you, charming," she replied. Unimpressed, she set the martini glass down on the coffee table with a deliberate clink. "If you think this little arrangement is going to change me, you're in for a surprise," Blake chuckled. "I could say the same. The first week of their marriage was a battle of wills." Blake assumed his usual arsenal of wealth and charm would win Emily over. He arranged for lavish dinners at exclusive restaurants, filled her walk-in closet with designer dresses, and even sent a luxury car to her studio. But Emily met each gesture with indifference, her responses cutting deeper than she likely realized. "Another dress," she said flatly, holding up a sequined gown that sparkled under the light. "Do you think glitter is a substitute for substance?" Blake smirked, leaning casually against the doorway. "It's a start." Emily let the dress fall back into the box. "Save your efforts, Blake. I'm not one of your board members, and I'm definitely not impressed by bribes." Her words lingered in the air as she left the room, her curls bouncing with each step. Blake stared after her, a mix of frustration and intrigue tightening in his chest. For the first time, someone wasn't falling into his orbit. Instead, she was pulling him into hers. Their days together revealed the depth of their differences. While Blake thrived on order and control, Emily lived in a controlled chaos that baffled him. Her art studio, tucked away in a quieter part of the city, was a vivid reflection of her mind. Paint-splattered floors, half-finished canvases, and the faint scent of turpentine filled the space. Blake had accompanied her there one afternoon, uninvited but determined to understand her world. "This is where you spend your time?" he asked, his tone tinged with disbelief. Emily looked up from a canvas she was working on, her hands streaked with paint. "Why? Is it not polished enough for you?" "It's different," he admitted, his eyes scanning the room. Emily smiled faintly, her gaze softening. "That's the point." For a moment, Blake felt an unfamiliar twinge of humility. This wasn't his world, and he wasn't the king here. He was an outsider, unsure of his footing. The tension between them reached a boiling point one evening when Blake brought home a gift he was certain would win her over, a rare painting from an artist she admired. He presented it with his usual flair, expecting at least a flicker of gratitude. Instead, Emily's reaction was cold. "You think this erases what your company did to my family?" Blake froze, the weight of her words sinking in. "Emily, I don't," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "You can't fix this with money or grand gestures. You can't buy forgiveness." Her words echoed in the silence that followed, and for the first time, Blake found himself unsure of what to say. Emily walked away, leaving him standing alone, the painting in his hands a stark reminder of the chasm between them. Ending note: as Blake sat alone in the dim light of the living room, he stared at the painting, realizing it was more than just an object. It was a symbol of everything he didn't understand about Emily. And for the first time, he felt the weight of his own arrogance pressing down on him. Emily sat at the desk in Blake's private study, the soft glow of a vintage desk lamp illuminating the mahogany surface. Her fingers trailed over the edge of a folder embossed with the logo of Cooper Enterprises. The name alone sent a sharp pang through her chest. This wasn't just a corporation, it was the force that had dismantled her family's business, leaving her parents in financial ruin. Her hands shook slightly as she opened the folder. Inside were neatly arranged documents detailing acquisitions, contracts, and cold calculations. Her eyes scanned the pages, searching for the connection she knew had to be there. And then she saw it, a transaction dated 5 years ago. Cooper Enterprises had purchased her family's company for a fraction of its worth, just before declaring it bankrupt. Her breath hitched. "So, it's true," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and validation. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her snap the folder shut. She tucked it back into the drawer just as the door opened. "Emily," Blake's voice was casual, but his sharp gaze swept the room, lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "I didn't expect to find you here." Emily forced a smile, standing quickly. "Your library is impressive. I thought I'd explore a little." Blake leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "Did you find anything interesting?" She held his gaze, willing herself to appear calm. "Just the usual books I'll never have time to read." He chuckled, but there was a trace of suspicion in his eyes. "Careful, Emily. You might find something that changes how you see me." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "I doubt anything could surprise me about you, Blake." That night, Emily lay awake in the guest bedroom of Blake's penthouse, her mind racing. The evidence was there, proof of the ruthless nature of Cooper Enterprises. But it wasn't enough. She needed more. The risk of getting caught wasn't lost on her. Yet the thought of walking away felt impossible. This was her chance to uncover the truth, to finally bring justice to her family. Meanwhile, Blake stood by the window in his own room, a glass of whiskey in hand. The city lights stretched endlessly below him, but his thoughts were fixed on Emily. Something about her didn't add up. She was too calm, too deliberate. He'd spent years reading people, unraveling their motives, and Emily was no exception. He didn't know what she was hiding yet, but he was determined to find out. The tension between them simmered the next day. Over breakfast, Blake observed Emily with the keen interest of a predator watching its prey. She, in turn, maintained her usual composure, her casual remarks and easy smiles a carefully crafted shield. "Do you always wake up this early?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. Emily sipped her coffee. "Only when I have something important to do. Anything I should know about?" His tone was light, but the undercurrent of suspicion was unmistakable. "Nothing you'd find interesting," she replied smoothly. "Art supplies and errands, mostly." Blake's lips curved into a half-smile. "You're hard to pin down, Emily." She looked up, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Good. I like to keep it that way." Later, as Blake headed to his office, Emily seized the opportunity to return to his study. This time, she searched deeper, opening drawers and rifling through files. Amidst the papers, she found a handwritten note addressed to Blake from one of his executives. The message was cryptic but clear enough to confirm her suspicions. Cooper Enterprises had knowingly sabotaged smaller businesses, including her family's. Her chest tightened with anger and grief. How could someone be so careless with other people's lives? She snapped a photo of the note with her phone, her hands trembling. Just as she was about to leave, the door creaked open. She froze, her heart pounding. "Emily." Blake's voice was calm, but his expression was anything but. His eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he stepped inside. "Care to explain what you're doing?" The soft murmur of voices filled the grand ballroom of a charity event Blake had insisted they attend together. Emily, dressed in a flowing emerald green gown, moved gracefully through the crowd, her eyes sharp and observant. She wasn't here for the glitz or glamour. She never was. Tonight, her purpose was to blend in, to gather more information while keeping Blake at arm's length. Blake, however, had other plans. He watched her from across the room, his dark eyes narrowing as he noted the ease with which she navigated the space. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. She didn't fawn over his wealth, didn't hang on his every word. If anything, she seemed to actively resist him, and it only intrigued him more. "Enjoying yourself?" Blake's voice cut through her thoughts as he appeared beside her, holding a glass of champagne. Emily turned, her lips curving into a polite smile. "As much as one can at these events," he smirked. "You have a talent for making everything sound mundane, maybe because it is." she replied, taking a sip of her drink. Blake chuckled, his gaze softening for a moment. You're impossible, you know that? Emily raised an eyebrow. You say that like it's a bad thing. Later that evening, as the charity auction began, Emily found herself seated beside Blake at a table near the stage. The host, a prominent philanthropist, spoke passionately about the cause they were supporting, a foundation for underprivileged children. As the bidding started, Blake raised his paddle almost casually, offering an exorbitant sum without hesitation. Is this your idea of helping? Emily whispered, her tone sharper than intended. Blake glanced at her, his expression unreadable. I believe in using what I have to make a difference. Buying your way into redemption, she asked, her green eyes piercing. For a moment, Blake didn't respond. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice low. What about you, Emily? What are you hoping to achieve tonight? The question caught her off guard, and for the first time, she felt the weight of his scrutiny. He wasn't just a billionaire playing games, there was something deeper in his eyes, something almost vulnerable. As the night wore on, Blake's charm worked its way through the room. He spoke effortlessly with donors and organizers, his polished demeanor winning smiles and admiration. But Emily couldn't shake the memory of their earlier conversation. There was something about Blake, an unexpected sincerity that clashed with the image she'd built of him. After the event, Blake insisted on walking her to the car, the cool night air wrapping around them. The city lights glittered like 1,000 tiny stars. And for a brief moment, the tension between them seemed to ease. You surprise me, Blake, Emily admitted, her voice softer than usual. He glanced at her, his smirk fading. Good or bad? I haven't decided yet. Blake smiled faintly, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. Well, I'll take what I can get. The next morning, Emily found herself sketching in her studio, unable to shake the image of Blake from her mind. She hated how easily he could get under her skin, how moments of vulnerability made her question her resolve. But she couldn't afford distractions, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. Meanwhile, Blake paced his office, his mind racing with questions about Emily. She was hiding something, he was certain of it, and yet he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, the way she challenged him in ways no one else dared. The sun was setting over Manhattan, casting a golden glow across Blake's penthouse. Emily stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her arms crossed as she watched the city come alive with evening lights. She had spent the day trying to piece together the threads of her family's downfall, but the deeper she dug, the more entangled. Blake entered the room quietly, his presence commanding as always. He carried 2 glasses of wine, offering one to her. You've been quiet today, he remarked, his tone light but probing. Emily accepted the glass, but didn't turn to face him. Just tired, Blake studied her, his sharp gaze noticing the tension in her posture. Tired or hiding something? The question hung in the air, heavier than either of them expected. Emily finally turned, her green eyes meeting his. Why do you always assume I have something to hide? Because you do, Blake replied, stepping closer. His tone wasn't accusatory, but there was an edge to it. You've been avoiding questions about your past since the day we met. Emily's grip on the wine glass tightened. And you've avoided questions about why you're really doing this, marrying someone like me. Blake's jaw clenched. Fair enough. But we're not talking about me right now. Emily set the glass down on the table, her movements sharp. Maybe we should. The confrontation escalated quickly. Words flew like daggers, each trying to wound the other. Emily accused Blake of being shallow and self-centered, while Blake fired back, calling her guarded and impossible to trust. Do you even hear yourself? Emily demanded, her voice trembling with anger. You think throwing money at problems makes you a good person? Blake's eyes narrowed. And what about you? Hiding behind sarcasm and walls you won't let anyone breach? They stood facing each other, the tension crackling like electricity in the room. For a moment, neither spoke, their breathing heavy from the argument. But then, something shifted. The anger between them gave way to something deeper, something neither of them wanted to name. Blake broke the silence first, his voice softer. Why won't you let me in, Emily? Emily looked away, her defenses crumbling just enough to show the vulnerability beneath. Because I can't. Blake stepped closer, his expression unreadable. Can't or won't? Emily didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to the window, her reflection in the glass revealing more than she intended. Blake stood behind her, the space between them heavy with unspoken words. I don't know what you're running from, Blake said quietly, but you don't have to do it alone. Emily closed her eyes, his words striking a chord she wasn't ready to confront. You don't know anything about me, Blake sighed, stepping back. Maybe not, but I want to. That night, they avoided each other, retreating to their separate corners of the penthouse. But the argument lingered in both their minds, replaying in vivid detail. Emily hated how much his words had affected her, how they had exposed the cracks in her carefully constructed armor. Blake, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of frustration and admiration. Emily was unlike anyone he'd ever known, resilient, enigmatic, and maddeningly out of reach. He wanted to understand her, to unravel the mysteries she presented. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could. Blake stood in his office, his fingers drumming against the mahogany desk. The folder in front of him contained the first piece of clarity he'd managed to uncover about Emily's past. It wasn't much, a newspaper clipping, a few names, and a business transaction, but it was enough to tell him that her family had been directly impacted by one of his company's acquisitions. His chest tightened with an unfamiliar sensation, guilt. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. Mr. Cooper, your wife is here to see you. Blake hesitated before responding. Send her in. Emily entered, her expression guarded as always. She carried a sketch pad tucked under one arm, her stance casual but deliberate. Busy, I see, she remarked, her green eyes darting to the papers on his desk. Always, Blake replied, his voice cool. He motioned for her to sit, but she remained standing. What do you really know about me, Blake? She asked suddenly, her tone sharper than usual. Blake's brow furrowed. What kind of question is that? Emily shrugged, but her gaze was piercing. You like control. You like knowing everything about the people around you. So, tell me, what have you found? Blake leaned back in his chair, studying her. What makes you think I've been looking? Because it's what I would do, she admitted, a rare flicker of honesty breaking through her armor. And I know you're not as oblivious as you pretend to be. The tension between them was palpable. Blake finally spoke, his tone softer than before. I know that Cooper Enterprises acquired your family's company 5 years ago. I know it wasn't handled well. Emily's lips tightened. Not well. That's an understatement. I didn't know the details, Blake said, his voice tinged with frustration. If I had, don't, Emily interrupted, her hands trembling. Don't pretend you would have done anything differently. Your company destroyed my family's livelihood. My father hasn't been the same since. My mother. Her voice broke slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. You can't undo that, Blake. For a moment, Blake was silent. Then he stood, moving toward her cautiously. You're right. I can't undo it, but I can try to make it right. Emily laughed bitterly. With what? Another check? A donation to some charity in my family's name? Blake shook his head. No, I mean real change. Fixing the policies that allowed it to happen in the first place. Her eyes widened slightly, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. But the anger in her chest still burned. Why should I believe you? Blake hesitated, then took a deep breath. Because I've never met anyone like you, Emily. You make me want to be better. That evening, Emily returned to the penthouse, her mind swirling with emotions. She wanted to hate Blake, to hold on to the anger that had fueled her for so long. But his words had struck a chord she couldn't ignore. Could he really change? Did she even want to believe him? Meanwhile, Blake stayed late at the office, poring over documents and making phone calls. For the first time in years, he questioned the foundation of his empire. If it had caused so much harm, what did that say about him? The next day, Emily found herself back in Blake's study. She couldn't resist searching for more answers. Hidden among a stack of folders, she found a letter and email printout from one of Blake's senior executives. The contents made her stomach turn. It was a calculated plan to bankrupt her family's business, a move designed to eliminate competition. Blake's name was listed as the final signatory. Her hands shook as she held the paper. He knew, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. He knew all along. Just then, the door opened, and Blake stepped inside. His face fell when he saw what she was holding. "Emily," he began, his voice heavy with regret. "I can explain." She turned to him, her expression a mix of anger and heartbreak. "No, Blake, you can't." Blake stood at the edge of the construction site, the wind tugging at his coat. The noise of heavy machinery and the distant murmur of workers filled the air. This was one of the many properties owned by Cooper Enterprises, a site slated for luxury condos. But today, it felt more like a monument to his mistakes. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the stillness. It was a call from his business partner, Andrew Steele. "What is it?" Blake answered, his tone clipped. "You've been missing meetings, Blake," Andrew said. "Care to explain what's going on?" Blake hesitated, his gaze fixed on the skeletal framework of the building. "I'm rethinking some things." "Rethinking?" Andrew scoffed. "What are you talking about?" "About the way we've been doing business," Blake replied, his voice firm. "About the people we've hurt along the way." Andrew's laughter was cold. "This isn't about that artist, is it? Don't tell me you're letting her get into your head." Blake's jaw tightened. "This isn't about Emily. It's about doing what's right. Right doesn't keep us in business." Andrew snapped. "Don't forget who you are, Blake. You're a Cooper. You don't owe anyone anything." Blake ended the call without responding, the weight of Andrew's words pressing down on him. For years, he had believed that his success justified the cost. But now, he wasn't so sure. Meanwhile, Emily sat in her studio, staring at the half-finished painting before her. Her brush hovered above the canvas, but she couldn't bring herself to add another stroke. The revelation of Blake's involvement in her family's downfall had been a blow she wasn't prepared for. And yet, she couldn't shake the memory of his promise to change. She glanced at her phone, her finger hovering over his name. She hated how conflicted she felt, how anger and hope seemed to coexist within her. Finally, she set the phone aside, letting the silence of the studio envelop her. That evening, Blake returned to the penthouse to find Emily sitting on the couch, her arms crossed. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "Have you come to confess?" she asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. Blake sighed, setting his briefcase down. "I won't make excuses for what happened, but I need you to know I didn't know the full extent of what my company did to your family." "If I had, you didn't know?" Emily interrupted, her voice rising. "You signed the papers, Blake. You made the decisions." Blake met her gaze, his expression earnest. "I trusted people I shouldn't have. I let them handle things without questioning enough. That doesn't absolve me, but it's the truth." Emily stood, her frustration palpable. "Do you know what it's like to watch your parents lose everything? To see their dreams destroyed while people like you profit?" Blake took a step closer, his voice steady. "I can't undo the past, Emily, but I can try to make amends." "How?" she demanded. "With another check? Another grand gesture?" "No," he said firmly. "By holding the people responsible accountable. By changing the way we do business. Starting with me." The sincerity in Blake's voice caught Emily off guard. For a moment, she saw a man willing to sacrifice his own legacy to right his wrongs. But was it enough? Could she trust him? "I don't know if I believe you," she admitted, her voice softening slightly. Blake nodded. "I wouldn't expect you to." Not yet. The next morning, Blake arrived at the Cooper Enterprises boardroom. Andrew and the other executives were already seated, their expressions varying from curiosity to irritation. "Let's get one thing straight," Blake began, his tone commanding. "Cooper Enterprises is going to change. Effective immediately. We're reviewing every acquisition, every policy. If it doesn't pass the test of ethics, it's gone." Andrew leaned back in his chair, smirking. "And what happens to the profits?" "Blake, you're talking about gutting the company. I'd rather lose profits than my integrity," Blake replied. "And if you can't get on board with that, you're welcome to leave." The dim glow of the desk lamp illuminated the paper in Emily's trembling hands. She reread the anonymous message, her heart pounding. It was concise but damning. Your family's downfall wasn't just corporate. Someone close to Blake orchestrated it. The word sent a chill down her spine. For years, she had directed her anger toward Cooper Enterprises and, by extension, Blake. But now, the idea that someone within his circle had deliberately targeted her family made her blood boil. She clenched her fists, her mind racing. Who could it be? And why? The memory of her father's anguish and her mother's quiet despair pushed her to act. She had to confront Blake this time with no hesitation. Blake was sitting in the penthouse's sleek kitchen, nursing a glass of whiskey, when Emily stormed in. Her green eyes blazed with determination, and her presence was like a storm breaking into his calm. Who was it? She demanded, slamming the note onto the counter. Blake blinked, caught off guard. Who was what? Emily stepped closer, her voice sharp. Who in your company destroyed my family? And don't tell me you don't know. Blake frowned, picking up the note. As he read it, his expression darkened. Where did you get this? Does it matter? Emily shot back. I need the truth, Blake. No more games. Blake set the note down carefully, his jaw tightening. I don't know who sent this, but if someone in my company was involved beyond the acquisition, it wasn't just an acquisition. Emily interrupted, her voice cracking. It was sabotage. My father trusted your company, and they crushed him. Who gave the order, Blake? Her words pierced through his defenses. Blake looked away, his mind racing. Could Andrew have been behind it, or someone else on the board? The thought that someone in his trusted inner circle could be capable of such deliberate cruelty made his stomach churn. I'll find out, he said finally, his voice steady. Emily folded her arms, her expression skeptical. And how do I know you're not just covering for them? Blake stepped closer, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Because I care about you, Emily, and I care about the truth. Let me prove it. The next day, Blake convened a private meeting with Andrew and the other top executives. He laid the anonymous note on the table, his expression hard. Someone here orchestrated the sabotage of the Rivers family business, he said, his voice cold. And I want to know who. Andrew leaned back in his chair, feigning ignorance. Blake, this is absurd. You can't seriously believe. Don't. Blake snapped, his tone cutting. I know how this company has operated in the past. I'm done turning a blind eye. The room fell silent. One of the junior executives shifted uncomfortably, but it was Andrew who finally broke the tension. Blake, you're treading dangerous ground, he said, his voice low. Be careful who you accuse. Blake's jaw tightened. I'll get to the bottom of this. Andrew, with or without your cooperation. Meanwhile, Emily took matters into her own hands. She visited her parents, something she hadn't done in months. Their modest home felt smaller than she remembered, the weight of their struggles etched into every corner. Her father sat in his worn armchair, his eyes tired but warm as he greeted her. Emily, this is a surprise. I need to ask you something, she said, sitting across from him. About the deal with Cooper Enterprises, her father sighed, rubbing his temples. I've told you everything, Emily. They bought us out and then filed for bankruptcy. There's nothing more to say. What about the people involved? She pressed. Did anyone seem off? Her father hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face. There was one man. He came to me before the deal was finalized. Told me it was in my best interest to sell, that resisting would only make things worse. Do you remember his name? Emily asked, her voice urgent. Her father shook his head. I don't, but he wasn't like the others. He seemed calculating. Emily's heart sank. She needed more. The missing piece was so close, yet still out of reach. Back at the penthouse, Blake found a crucial clue in the company archives, a series of emails from Andrew detailing the deliberate steps taken to bankrupt the Rivers family. It wasn't just a business move. It was a personal vendetta. Blake's chest tightened as he read the final email. Let's eliminate the competition for good. They won't see it coming. Blake wasted no time confronting Andrew. The argument was explosive, with accusations flying and truths spilling out. Andrew admitted to orchestrating the sabotage, but his reasoning was chillingly pragmatic. It was just business. Blake, Andrew said, his voice cold. They were in our way. Blake's fists clenched, his anger barely contained. You ruined lives, Andrew. This isn't just about business, it's about decency. Don't act like you're above it all. Andrew sneered. You've benefited from every decision we've made. Not anymore, Blake replied, his voice firm. You're out. Blake stood in front of the towering glass facade of Cooper Enterprises, his reflection staring back at him. The man he saw felt like a stranger, one who had once valued power above all else, but now stood ready to dismantle the very foundation of his success. Today wasn't about profits or prestige. It was about accountability. Inside the conference room, the air was tense. Andrew Steele sat across the table, his smirk a thin veneer of confidence. The other board members exchanged uneasy glances as Blake entered, his presence commanding the room. Let's make this clear, Blake began, his voice steady. Cooper Enterprises will no longer operate at the expense of others. Andrew chuckled, leaning back in his chair. And how do you plan to keep this company afloat? Morality doesn't pay dividends. Blake ignored him, sliding a stack of papers across the table. Effective immediately, every unethical acquisition, including the Rivers family business, will be reviewed. We will compensate the families affected and implement policies to ensure this never happens again. Murmurs rippled through the room. Andrew's smirk faltered. You're throwing away everything we built. No, Blake replied firmly. I'm rebuilding it the right way. Later that evening, Blake found Emily in her studio, the smell of turpentine and fresh paint filling the air. She stood by a large canvas, her fingers smeared with vibrant colors. Her expression softened as she saw him, though she remained guarded. How did it go? She asked, her voice neutral. I fired Andrew, Blake said, stepping closer. And I'm taking steps to compensate your family and others we've hurt. Emily turned back to her painting, her brush moving in slow, deliberate strokes. It's a start, Blake sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know it won't erase the damage we caused, but I'm trying, Emily. Not just for you, but because it's the right thing to do. She paused, her shoulders tensing. Why now, Blake? Why not years ago? Because I didn't see it then, he admitted. I was too focused on winning, on proving myself. But you, he hesitated, his voice softening. You made me realize there's more to life than power. Emily set her brush down, turning to face him. Her green eyes searched his, looking for the sincerity she so desperately wanted to find. I don't know if I can forgive you, Blake. Not yet. I don't expect you to, he said quietly. I just want a chance to prove that I'm not the man I used to be. In the days that followed, Blake took decisive action. He called a press conference, standing before a crowd of reporters and cameras. His statement was bold and unprecedented, admitting the mistakes of his company and outlining the steps he would take to make amends. The backlash was immediate. Investors pulled out, and the stock plummeted, but Blake stood firm. This is bigger than profits, he told the reporters. It's about integrity, about doing what's right. And I'm willing to sacrifice everything to ensure that Cooper Enterprises stands for something more. The headlines the next day were ruthless, branding him reckless and knave. But amidst the criticism, there were glimmers of support. Families affected by his company's actions began to speak out, some expressing gratitude for his efforts to make things right. Meanwhile, Emily received a package at her studio, a folder of documents from Blake. Inside were detailed records of the company's actions, including the reparations he had already begun to distribute. There was also a personal letter, handwritten in Blake's neat script. Emily, I can't change the past, but I hope these steps show you how much I've changed. You were right to hold me accountable, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of your trust. Emily's heart ached as she read his words. She wanted to hold on to her anger, to the pain that had driven her for so long. But she couldn't deny the truth. Blake was trying. He was becoming the man she never thought he could be. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Emily's studio, casting warm golden hues over the array of paintings scattered across the room. Emily sat at her work table, her hands still as she stared at the half-finished canvas in front of her. For months, her art had been her escape, a refuge from the whirlwind of emotions and revelations that had appended her life. But today, Her thoughts were elsewhere on Blake. The knock at the door broke her reverie. She stood slowly, her heart pounding as she opened it. Blake stood there, dressed simply in a dark coat and jeans, his face softer than she had ever seen it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Can I come in?" he asked finally, his voice tentative. Emily stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words as he looked around the studio, his eyes lingering on her latest work. "You've been busy," he said, his tone quiet. She nodded, crossing her arms. "It helps." Blake turned to face her, his expression earnest. "Emily, I meant every word in that letter. I've done everything I can to make things right. But none of it matters if I've lost you." Her chest tightened, and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "It's not that simple, Blake." "I know," he said, taking a step closer. "But I'm not asking for forgiveness or for things to go back to the way they were. I'm asking for a chance to build something real with you." Emily's hands trembled as she toyed with the hem of her sweater. "How do I know you won't go back to who you were?" Blake hesitated, his voice softening. "You don't. But I've seen what that life cost me, what it cost others. And I'm done being that man. For the first time, I feel like I'm living for something more." Emily's green eyes met his, her resolve wavering. "You hurt me, Blake. You hurt my family. That's not something I can just forget." "I don't want you to forget," Blake replied. "I want you to hold me accountable, to remind me every day of the man I'm trying to become." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, and she looked away, her defenses crumbling. She wanted to believe him, to believe that the man standing before her was truly different. But trust was a fragile thing, and she wasn't sure if hers could be rebuilt. Blake stepped closer, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, unadorned ring and held it out to her. "This isn't about a bet or a deal," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "This is about you and me. I love you, Emily, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you." Emily stared at the ring, her emotions swirling. It wasn't the grand gesture she had expected from someone like Blake. It was simple, genuine, and honest. She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can promise forever, Blake. You don't have to," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Just promise me today." The days that followed were tentative but hopeful. Emily began to let Blake back into her life, step by cautious step. He didn't rush her, understanding that trust couldn't be forced. Together, they visited her parents, where Blake apologized with a sincerity that left her father speechless. Meanwhile, Blake continued his efforts to rebuild Cooper Enterprises, stepping down from his role as CEO to ensure the changes he implemented would endure beyond him. The company's transformation became a beacon of ethical business practices, and while the journey was far from easy, it was one Blake embraced wholeheartedly. Months later, Emily and Blake stood on the balcony of her studio, watching the sun set over the city. The warmth of the evening wrapped around them as Blake slid his hand into hers. "Do you ever think about what brought us here?" she asked, her voice soft. "All the time," Blake admitted, "and as crazy as it was, I wouldn't change a thing." Emily smiled faintly, leaning her head against his shoulder. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of peace. The future was uncertain, but for now, that was enough. What lesson did this incredible story bring to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Don't forget to subscribe to Golden Stories and give this video a like. We create each story with great care and dedication, and your support helps us keep bringing these special tales to life. Thank you for being part of our community, and see you in the next one.